But this is vital to understand, because I think that when we hear, oh, it's from a plant, it's natural, and then you also have a receptor for these endogenous cannabinoid receptors, and therefore the marriage of those two, right? The coming together of the chemical, THC or CBD or both, with these receptors is somehow supposed to happen, as if this was a purpose of having these receptors. But it's simply not the case. In the same way that the nicotinic receptors are not there because nicotine is good for us. They're there because there are compounds that exist within us that are good to bind to those receptors from time to time. Now, here's the key thing about, I guess today I'm saying there are a lot of key things, but here's another key thing about understanding cannabis and the way that it works, which is that THC and CBD, when they're brought into the brain and body by smoking or, edible, etc., they bind to those receptors, those endogenous cannabinoid receptors, and they tap into the same systems that your endogenous cannabinoids would tap into, the ones that affect mood and energy and creativity and relaxation, etc. But they do so with 1,000-fold greater potency. And as a consequence of that, your endogenous cannabinoids are outcompeted. They really get no opportunity to interact with those receptors. And understanding that can lead to a very clear understanding of why, for instance, when people use cannabis to relieve anxiety, or they use cannabis to enter a certain brain state for creativity or to enter sleep, why a dependence on cannabis starts to emerge. Because if they don't ingest cannabis, and again, ingest could mean smoke to bring THC in or CBD in, or ingest orally or even transdermal or tincture or one of the other varieties, if they don't do that, then what happens is not only are the receptors not stimulated to the same degree or with the same potency that they normally are, but the endogenous cannabinoids can no longer have their effect. So people experience heightened levels of anxiety, disrupted mood, disrupted brain state, and so on. Smoking marijuana or consuming marijuana by edible changes one's speech and does it in a very specific way. And in this study by Adam Vogel and colleagues, they explored a huge different variety of aspects of speech. And this can be done using spectral processing, which is, fancy nerd speak for looking at how much inflection there is, or looking at how long people hold vowels or consonants, etc. And again, these are people not under the influence of cannabis, but rather people who tend to be under the influence of cannabis when not participating in the study. In other words, chronic recreational cannabis users. So what are the two major shifts that cannabis causes on our patterns of speech? Well, the first one is a change in what's called spectral tilt. Again, that's fancy nerd speak for vocal effort and intensity. A pot smoker or somebody who uses recreational cannabis fairly often would have reduced spectral tilt, aka vocal effort intensity. In addition, there are changes in verbal timing, that is, pronunciation of words and accenting particular syllables of words in people that consume cannabis or smoke cannabis. So what's mainly different is the difference in the amount of enunciation and accenting of particular words and symbols within a sentence. So the total content that's delivered is exactly the same. And while I wasn't measuring my pace, the overall rate of communication is essentially the same. But there's less sort of lilting and falling of the voice and less accenting. That's the major consistent effect of cannabis use. Now, of course, there are examples of people who are using a lot of cannabis and it impacts brain centers involved in movement and speech, so much so that they really do have the really drawn out kind of nah. And oftentimes this will be detected in the laugh. There's this sort of stereotypical stoner laugh, as it's sometimes called, rather than say, ha ha, or that's a fake laugh, obviously. It's hard to make myself laugh if something's not actually funny. I have to think of something funny. When people say, like that's a bit more of the way I might laugh, like sort of the inspiratory laugh, or the, which is expiratory laugh. People who use cannabis chronically will often do the, right, which is sort of the back of the throat. It's sort of this, it's neither inspiratory nor expiratory laugh. And believe it or not, there's an entire literature on inspiratory, inhaling, versus expiratory laughs. And there's also a literature on cannabis altering the pattern of inspiratory and expiratory laughs. It almost sounds like a sarcastic laugh, when in fact they may not be feeling sarcastic at all. And I have a very close friend and colleague who's a phenomenal neurosurgeon and neuroscientist by the name of Dr. Eddie Chang. He's the chair of neurosurgery at UCSF, and his lab and him are expert in the study of neuroscience controlling language and speech. And he often tells me that he can predict with almost certainty whether or not somebody is a regular cannabis user based not just on the patterns of speech that they use, but even just by recording specific neurons in their brain that underlie the laugh reflex and certain patterns of speech. So this idea that cannabis use changes your ability to speak and enunciate clearly does appear to be true. And the stereotype that cannabis use tends to create more of a drawl or kind of a, if you will, a laziness in the laugh and some of the reflexive enunciations that people use does also appear to be true. And I say all that, of course, with the caveat that many people out there will know individuals, or perhaps you yourselves are individuals that may use cannabis, but that have incredible articulation, probably better than mine and better than other people out there who speak for a living. So I'm not saying that 100% of people that use cannabis regularly can't speak well or clearly. That's simply not what I'm saying, and I don't want to communicate that idea at all. But it is the case that people who are regular cannabis users are impacting the neural circuits involved in movement. Movement also controls speech, and therefore cannabis is impacting speech. It is very clear that smoking cannabis increases prolactin levels. Very, very clear. Now, you might say, didn't you just describe a study about a set of individuals whose prolactin didn't increase, and as a consequence, their level of sexual desire went up? Yes, there are a subset of individuals for which that's true. But people who smoke cannabis do experience increases in prolactin, and that's especially pronounced in people that smoke cannabis more than twice a week. So this is important. Prolactin, as I referred to earlier, is reciprocal or mutually inhibitory with dopamine. One way to think about this is in the context of the normal sexual arousal arc, whereby dopamine is increased when people are sexually aroused, but then after orgasm, both in males and females, prolactin levels skyrocket. This is actually what creates the so-called refractory period for males, during which they cannot achieve erection again for some period of time. That relates directly to how long the prolactin increase lasts. Okay? Nature is smart and has arranged a set of hormones and circuits in the brain and body such that when tending to a newborn is the most important thing, it reduces the importance of producing more children and sexual activity in those moments and days and weeks, sometimes longer. So when prolactin levels are up, dopamine levels are down. Smoking marijuana more than twice a week significantly increases prolactin. The general rules are smoking marijuana increases prolactin in men and women, which will reduce dopamine and testosterone. Smoking marijuana chronically, meaning more than twice a week, does appear to reduce testosterone significantly and elevate so-called aromatase enzymes, which are the enzymes that convert testosterone into estrogen. This might partially explain the effect that occurs in about 35% of males, which is gynecomastia, which is a development of breast tissue in males. So it does appear that marijuana and cannabis increase estrogen, reduce testosterone, increase prolactin, especially in chronic users. Now, I'm sure that some people out there will say, well, their testosterone levels are exceedingly high, or they are fine, meaning the constellation of symptoms associated with low testosterone and elevated estrogen are not present in them. That probably means one of two things, or both. They either had elevated levels of testosterone to begin with, so their ceiling was higher, so bringing it down didn't have that much of an effect, or that they have very low levels of aromatase in their system. It does seem to alter sperm motility and sperm health and function when taken chronically more than twice per week, in particular high doses of high-potency THC. This is something we will cover in far more detail on a future episode all about fertility. And in females, there's an increase in estrogen as a consequence of smoking marijuana and increasing prolactin and estrogen in parallel. Whether or not that's detrimental isn't clear, although I point out that elevated estrogen and prolactin can be associated, not necessarily, and certainly not causative, but can be associated with elevated levels of or frequency of breast cancer detection. So cannabis and its effects on hormones are not without consequence. There are effects of cannabis on cortisol. In some individuals, it greatly increases cortisol due to the anxiety and paranoia it can create. And in other individuals, it reduces cortisol. Again, we have these divergent effects. But I want to be very clear. The effects on prolactin, meaning elevated prolactin, the effects on testosterone, meaning at least most studies point to reduced levels of testosterone and increased estrogen. That seems to be true for most all individuals that chronically use cannabis. Whereas the effects on cortisol tend to be divergent. Cannabis increases cortisol in some individuals and decreases cortisol in others. In general, increases in cortisol that are ongoing are not healthy for us, and so on. And then, of course, there are other effects on hormones, and I'll just briefly summarize those, that THC in particular, not CBD, but THC in particular, is known to be strongly inhibitory for something called gonadotropin-releasing hormone. This is a hormone that's released from the brain, from the hypothalamus, that then feeds onto, or I should say signals to the pituitary gland, which is also near the roof of your mouth. A lot of stuff happening near the roof of your mouth, it turns out, biologically. And reduced levels of gonadotropin-releasing hormone caused by cannabis use, reduced levels of LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH, which reduce levels of testosterone and sperm production in males, and egg health and ovulation and menstrual function in females. Now, I'm sure there are a number of women out there who will say they have perfectly normal menstrual cycles despite using cannabis. I'm certainly not going to dispute that. But if you are somebody who's trying to maximize fertility or regulate or balance hormones, marijuana and cannabis reduces GnRH, that is the gonadotropin released from the hypothalamus, and thereby reduces luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone, which are released from the pituitary and travel in the bloodstream to support normal ovarian function and health and normal testicular function and health in females and males, respectively. If you don't already know this, I'll make it very clear and I'll make it very brief. Whether or not you smoke or vape, tobacco or cannabis, you are severely impairing the function of endothelial cells that make up the capillaries and blood vessels of your brain and body. And that is known to decrease cognitive capacity over time, increase probability of strokes, severely impact lung function, and also lead to things like peripheral neuropathies. It leads to sexual dysfunction because of lack of blood flow to the genitals, can lead to other aspects of reproductive damage, including to the ovaries and testes. Essentially, there is no other way to state it except that smoking and vaping have negative health consequences that are independent of the substances that people are trying to get into their bloodstream by smoking or vaping. So people smoke and vape tobacco and people smoke and vape cannabis. And in both cases, if we just set aside the direct effects of tobacco and the direct effects of cannabis, we can confidently say that the process of smoking, of inhaling smoke into the lungs, and yes, also vaping, bringing the chemicals that transport nicotine, or in this case, cannabis, into the lungs by way of vaping, are both severely detrimental to endothelial cells. I think a few years ago when vaping wasn't as prominent, there was this question and this idea that maybe vaping was going to be far healthier, or at least not as bad as smoking. But now we can see a huge number of negative health effects of vaping, some of which are distinct from the effects of smoking. But I think that the advent of edible forms of cannabis and the combination of THC and CBD in certain products, and the fact that most people view CBD as safer because it does not include or does not have, I should say, the psychoactive effects that THC does, has led to a situation where you have 15% of pregnant mothers using cannabis at some point during pregnancy, and maybe even frequently throughout pregnancy. And the effects on the developing fetus are completely unknown. But recall that cannabis and THC and CBD outcompete, meaning they park in the receptor for endogenous cannabinoids and prevent endogenous cannabinoids from having their normal level and pattern of action. So this is absolutely critical. I cannot encourage you enough, or rather I should say I cannot discourage enough the use of cannabis and any related compounds in cannabis, edible or smoked, certainly not smoked, but even edible during pregnancy. And certainly in breastfeeding, lactating mothers, the same is also true. Recall that cannabis and THC and CBD are incredibly lipophilic. They They are fat soluble and they get into cells very readily, and they cross the blood-brain barrier, they cross the blood-placental barrier. So when I encountered this statistic, I had to kind of wipe my eyes a few times. I could not believe it. And yet I cross-checked that number with a few other studies. A few others have come in a little bit lower at, somewhere like 13 to 14%, and a few have come in a little bit higher, but the average of 15% is both striking and shocking. So I don't know how to make the message more clear. I hope that is clear. Please do not use any cannabis, THC, or related things, including CBD, smoked or edible, if you're pregnant, lactating, etc. When a compound, a drug, or whatever you want to call it, becomes legal, there's a tendency to assume that it's safe and safe for everybody. And with respect to cannabis and THC, and perhaps even CBD, but certainly for THC and cannabis that's smoked or vaped or consumed in edible form, that is simply not the case. There are clear data pointing to negative health effects of cannabis use and THC use. There are very strong data, and I will provide links to these resources, pointing to the fact that for people who are chronic users of cannabis, that is using it twice a week or more, that over time their levels of anxiety actually increase. And this is true even for individuals that are using strains of cannabis that, while under the influence of cannabis, reduce anxiety. Over time, meaning over the course of 12 or more months, there is a well-documented effect of the anxiety relief that cannabis and THC initially brought being less and less potent. That is, people need to smoke more of it or ingest more THC in order to achieve the same level of anxiety relief. And in some cases, a switch from anxiety relief to increase in anxiety. And again, that's increase in anxiety not just when the drug is not being consumed, but also while under the influence of the drug. So when people are using THC more than twice a week, what ends up happening is those G protein coupled receptors and the downstream signaling mechanisms start to adjust themselves, and it requires more and more drug, so either higher dosages or more frequent use. And a lot of the positive effects, the so-called decrease in anxiety, increased focus, increased creativity, some of that starts to wane. It starts to dissipate, and people wonder why they have to use so much cannabis just to achieve a fraction of the effect that they used to be able to achieve with even a lower dose. So anxiety is getting worse over time, and that's anxiety during the drug use and outside of the drug use. Some people work around that or try to work around that by using varying strains of cannabis or changing the pattern of delivery from, smoking to vaping, or from vaping to edible, and from edible to transdermal. Anyway, they go through a lot of gymnastics and writhing and seeking, but nonetheless, anxiety increases over time. Also, it's very clear that depression increases over time, and especially, this is surprising to me, but especially for individuals that were not depressed at the outset of their use. In other words, they didn't start using cannabis because they were depressed, but rather the depression starts to emerge as a consequence of the cannabis and THC use. So that's serious. In fact, we now know, based on really solid epidemiological evidence, that depression is not a strong predictor of seeking out cannabis. It doesn't drive terribly many people to seek out cannabis use. But cannabis use itself makes people 4 times likelier to develop a chronic major depression. So anxiety is increasing, depression is increasing. During the ages of 16 to 24, the cannabinoid receptors are still available. They are not being as strongly driven by endogenous cannabinoids, but by ingestion of THC and or CBD, there are downstream effects on the signaling within those cells that all the data point to creating a much, much higher likelihood of developing major depression, severe anxiety, or psychosis at later ages. So to be very clear, cannabis use between the ages of 16 to 24 in both males and females is increasing anxiety, increasing depression in the immediate years and within the 1 year's time or so much so that people are using the cannabis ongoing in an attempt to reduce that anxiety and reduce that depression. But in addition to that, the cannabis use, and because of the signaling mechanisms involved, are predisposing those individuals to psychosis later in life. If you look at individuals who start using cannabis even younger, age 14, or even as young as 12, the probability of psychosis later in life, in particular schizophrenic or schizophrenic-like episodes, more than doubles. So this is a really serious concern. The use of cannabis in young populations is very strongly predisposing people to psychotic episodes. And we know the mechanism by which this occurs. This occurs by a thinning of the so-called gray matter. And it's called gray matter because with neurons, nerve cells, they have a so-called cell body. That's the part that contains the DNA and manufactures all the neurotransmitters, et cetera. And those are shipped out to the other parts of the neuron that include the axon, the wires between axons. And those axons under the microscope, because they have a lot of fatty tissue around them, and this is healthy fatty tissue that allows electrical transmission to be fast, that fatty tissue, those portions of the cells are called white matter. So you have gray matter and white matter. Gray matter are the so-called cell bodies where the DNA and all the stuff is manufactured. White matter are the axons or the wires through which all the key components are shipped out to the synapse, et cetera. This was published in Translational Psychiatry just this year, point to the fact that adolescent cannabis use accelerates the thinning of the prefrontal cortex and the gray matter in particular. So what this means is, while during normal development, the gray matter, the prefrontal cortex, and all the cells there are indeed intended. It's a normal process for it to thicken and then thin a little bit as connections are adjusted and people learn and mature and grow up. This is part of the normal, healthy maturational process, independent of cannabis use. When kids, because these really are kids, use cannabis, and it doesn't matter the mode of cannabis delivery, whether or not it's vaping or smoking or edible, that gray matter thins at a much, much greater rate. And the reason I like this paper published in Translational Psychiatry this year so much is that they link the amount of cannabis use, heavy, moderate, light, or no cannabis use, to the rate of prefrontal cortical thinning. And it's absolutely clear from these data that the more often young people, meaning individuals between the age of 14 and 25, the more often they consume or smoke or vape cannabis, the faster and the more extreme that cortical thinning is. And the cortical thinning is occurring in exactly the area of the brain that's involved in planning, in control over one's emotions, in reflexes, in organizing one's life in a number of different ways, anywhere from cleaning one's room, literally, knowing what goes where, to making plans that extend out through the day, through the week, through a year. Essentially becoming a functional human being involves using your prefrontal cortex in a variety of different contexts and different sort of time domains, the time domain of an hour, the time domain of a day. Making plans and being able to execute plans is fundamental to being a healthy human being. And it's absolutely clear from these data that the more cannabis one uses, the more impaired those neural circuits are. There's simply no other way to view these data. In fact, so much so that even small amounts of cannabis use are associated with rates of cortical thinning and degrees of cortical thinning that are really detrimental and concerning for normal cognitive processes. But with that said, if you are in the age bracket that I've been referring to, this 14 to 25-year-old age bracket, and you are a occasional even or chronic cannabis user, you should be very, very careful and concerned about the long-term effects that could potentially have. That statement is bolstered by another statistic, which is that unlike a lot of other drugs, the rate of cannabis use is strongly related to how dangerous people perceive cannabis to be. We aren't just hearing that cannabis is safe, or it's not just being implied that cannabis is safer, but many more people are talking about the positive effects of cannabis without a lot of discussion about the negative effects of cannabis. That is entirely distinct from the issue of whether or not cannabis is safe for the developing brain and body. Again, I'm not demonizing anybody for using cannabis, but I want to make the point very simply and very directly. It is far and away a different circumstance for the brain for an individual to be 25 years or older and using cannabis in whatever form occasionally or maybe even frequently than it is for a young person aged 14 to 25 to be using cannabis, either by smoking or vaping, or by edible or any other form, on the brain and body. It's absolutely clear that the brain continues to develop at least until age 25, and that a huge number of systems related to mood regulation, so-called executive function, the ability to organize one's thoughts, plan, and execute plans, essentially to become a functional human being, right? That's one portion of becoming a functional human being, but certainly an essential one. All of that relies on the fine-tuning of this neural circuitry that we've been talking about up until now. And it's abundantly clear that cannabis, and THC in particular, dramatically disrupt those processes. So if this isn't clear enough just from my statements, I'd like to point to a particular paper. They evaluated a huge number of studies. They actually looked at more than 4,000 studies. They selected the ones that were only the most rigorous in terms of study design and analysis and rigor of conclusions. And they looked at how early use of cannabis impacted later probability of development of psychosis and other psychiatric conditions. And the takeaways from this study are very clear. First of all, chronic cannabis use, so more than twice per week, has consistently been associated with mental health disorders. I'm pulling some phrases directly from the paper. Heavy cannabis use, meaning cannabis use more frequent than twice per week, has been associated with 4 times the risk of psychosis later in life, in particular schizophrenia and bipolar-like episodes. Using cannabis, especially during adolescence and the teen years and up until age 25, create a 4 times greater risk of psychosis for those that have a predisposition to bipolar disorder and or schizophrenia. As they point out, and again, I'm paraphrasing here, this is the first systematic review of the association of cannabis potency. And all of the data point to a very clear conclusion, which is the more potent the THC concentration, the higher probability of developing psychosis or a major depressive episode or a major anxiety disorder later in life. That should be of particular concern because we are absolutely clear about the fact that with the advent of all these new strains of cannabis and with the engineering and availability of cannabis at much higher potency, meaning THC potency, the risk of psychosis is going up and is likely to continue going up unless something is done to reduce the frequency of cannabis use to 0, ideally, or to very low frequency, very low potency in adolescents and teens and people aged 25 or younger. I know a lot of people don't want to hear this message because, first of all, it's alarming. And second of all, as I mentioned earlier, the statistics tell us that the greatest number of people that are starting to use cannabis are in the age bracket of 16 to 24, plus the general perception out there because of the way that cannabis is discussed in the media and by sports figures and by celebrities and by politicians, etc., that it's not as bad as alcohol and maybe not that bad and maybe even has health benefits, then you're essentially setting up a system where young people are far more likely to adopt and continue cannabis use without realizing these serious health consequences that await them later. With all of that said, I of course again want to acknowledge that there have been well-demonstrated effects of cannabis for reducing pain, in particular in chemotherapy and in the context of reducing nausea in people suffering from cancer chemotherapy. There is a well-known effect that one can generally point to as positive using cannabis for things like glaucoma, for lowering intraocular pressure and offsetting the loss of neurons that would lead to blindness, although there are other tools, of course, that don't involve cannabis use that can accomplish that as well, so-called intraocular pressure lowering drugs or drops. I am in no way, shape, or form trying to rob the incredible efforts of the laboratories and people that have worked very hard to study and establish the valid uses of cannabis for treating various ailments and that continue to study cannabis in order to try and ameliorate the symptoms of different ailments. But today I really wanted to emphasize the biology of cannabis, some of the often discussed effects, rather than focus on all the potential positive and sort of emerging positive data about cannabis in different medical contexts. And at the same time, I strongly feel that it's important to acknowledge the shocking, because there's really no other way to describe it, the shocking effects of cannabis use on the developing fetus, and the fact that so many pregnant and lactating mothers are using cannabis. I mean, that number 15% still has me dizzy with kind of disbelief, and yet we need to acknowledge this and address this immediately. And I think it's vital to understand that cannabis use through any delivery mechanism, smoking or vaping or edible or otherwise, is very, very concerning, in fact, dangerous to the developing brain, certainly for the fetal brain and for the baby brain, but also for the adolescent brain and for the teen and young adult brain, not just because of the effects that it can have in the immediate term, those slow creeping increases in anxiety and depression brought on by cannabis use, but also the time release, if you will, on the development of psychosis and other types of major psychiatric disorders later in life.